Let's go. Walk.
Where are we going?
Get you some coffee. Did I do something to disrespect you?
Not yet.
Alright everybody, there's been this recent trend in movies for the last 5 or so years now where directors decide they want to have a really long shot. And in general, I think that's a pretty good thing. I would generally rather a movie be 5 shots per minute as opposed to 20 shots per minute, where it cuts so much you can't even really tell what's going on. But like all good things, there's a way to prepare it wrong. And not every long take is going to be amazing or even good, and not all of them are created equal. So today, we're just going to discuss various movies or television programs which have featured a long take in the last 5 or 6 years, discussing the implications of each shot and how it affects each movie overall. Note: for the purposes of this video, I will be grouping true long takes in with edited long takes, or multiple shots strung together in a way which appears as one shot. Seeing as how they are both ostensibly trying to communicate the same things or go for the same style, I see no purpose in differentiating between the two on this list. I'm also going to be moving in order of release date. Now let's get into it.
Please confirm link.
That's a negative. We're not seeing any data.
First up is Gravity. That movie everyone was losing their mind over when it came out, and everybody seems to have collectively forgotten at this point. Now on the whole, I'm not really a big fan of this movie, and even when I first saw it in the theaters, I didn't think it was that great. I think Sandra Bullock's performance kills the immersion and takes this movie down a few notches. It's hard to get invested in the spectacle and sheer level of craftsmanship when your main character sounds like they're about to orgasm for 90 minutes of your flick.
Astronaut is off structure, Dr. Stone.
Anyway, the scene we will be discussing here is the opening scene, a long shot which pans around these characters on a spaceship. At this point in the film, Sandra Bullock and George Clooney are just having a mundane conversation. Everything is kept extremely quiet except for the sound of their voices to emulate space. A design choice which would help further the contrast in about 2 minutes. Suddenly, oh shit, there's debris coming. There's about 2 straight minutes of the characters panicking and attempting to prepare for the worst. Setting the visuals aside for a moment, I think part of what makes this shot so great is the sound design. The soundtrack in the back slowly grows louder and louder until it overpowers the entire scene in a really dramatic way. You can hear transmissions coming in from Mother Base and different conversations between the astronauts slowly grow more frantic as they attempt to survive the oncoming doom. And all this culminates where the debris actually arrives. And to keep it more immersive, the debris makes no sound as it would in space. This means we have characters attempting to dodge the silent metal flying at high velocity. From a technical standpoint, this scene is incredible. Now the main reason I make note of all the sound design in this scene, despite this video primarily being focused on the visual component, is because this long take has one goal in mind first and foremost: immersion. The camera moves around the characters and floats just as a passive astronaut would watching these people. By having the camera move around instead of just combining stationary shots, you don't feel as if you were watching these people behind a window, but rather right beside them at every moment. For a movie which is so obviously trying to place you in space, this shot is excellent at achieving its goal. If this scene were instead done in multiple shots, or hell, even a single long take, but one that was much farther away and removed from the characters, the feeling communicated would be very different. If it were done in a single take but far away, you would feel less like you were on the ship and more like you were observing on a nearby ship. And if it were segmented, you would feel as if you were teleporting around the ship and not on board as an actual person. Anyway, this is probably the scene I have the least to say about, so let's move on. Up next is my favorite long take on the list, the ending scene of True Detective Episode 4. Now if you haven't seen the first season of the show, you definitely should, as it is probably in my top 5 seasons of television ever. That being said, I'm going to try and discuss the scene without spoiling too much for those of you who haven't seen it, but I am going to have to spoil a little bit. So one of the protagonists, Rust, played by Matthew McConaughey, is acting undercover in a drug ring to try and obtain information regarding their suspect. His goal is to basically play along and pretend he is one of them until he gets the information he needs. In exchange for information on their suspect, Rust must assist them in a raid, and this is where shit starts to get real. This long take lasts about 6 minutes and accomplishes so much in that little window. Within a few minutes of breaking into this place, there's a dispute between the gang Rust is with and who they are raiding. Rust is not involved in this dispute and is instead moving around the house frantically, taking people hostage and looking for the drugs. All while he is doing this, we overhear the dispute slowly escalating over time as Russ enters and re-enters the room. Even in the beginning of this scene, where nothing has really happened yet, you can still feel the enormous pressure. McConaughey's nervous performance really sells the idea that anyone or anything could be waiting around the corner, and that we're all just waiting for one little thing to go wrong before shit really gets real. And then...
Do not fire. Don't fucking fire. Do not fire.
Suddenly, Rust's entire plan falls out the window when he takes their leader hostage. What ensues is a one-shot escape sequence of Rust attempting to evade rival gang members, members of the gang he is with, and the police all simultaneously. One false move and Rust could either be captured, killed, or fired from his job. So just by writing circumstances alone, the stakes are very high, and the long take only further complements this scene. While still discussing the first half of the scene, I think something cool to note about the cinematography is just how Fukunaga knows when to pan the camera slowly and when to whip it around quickly. I also love this part where McConaughey just stands in the center of these two rooms, and you can see the contrast so blatantly. You have a successful raid and a happy drug runner on one side, next to a room with a continually escalating conflict. The gunshot here also acts as a trigger, determining the course of the rest of the scene. While the camera had mostly moved slow before this, in the ensuing chaos and muffled sound, the thing is flying around all over the place. Unlike the gravity scene, which is broadly used for immersion, this long take is used for what I consider to be the second primary strength of such a shot: creating tension. The scene easily could have been filmed with the camera cutting back and forth between the people arguing in the family room and Russ investigating the house, but instead the two are put seamlessly together into a single shot. This decision helps make the escalation feel all the more real, as we aren't cutting between two different shots done at two different moments in time which are obviously only sequential in post. The two characters really are arguing at the same time Rust is searching the house. The Wu-Tang Clan in the background growing louder and quieter also helps reinforce that this is a single moment in time, and when shit gets real, boy does it get real. So once Rust starts going, he has more than a few obstacles to overcome. As soon as he steps outside, the camera pans up to show a helicopter and let us know that not only must he avoid the people on the ground, he also has to avoid the police up in the air. Then he goes into a house to call his buddy, telling him to pick him up in 90 seconds. He leaves that house, gets attacked, and beats the two gang members. Then he goes around another house, hides in the back, and the camera is positioned where we see the gang members run away from us. However, one of their female's friends stays behind, and she notices Russ run by and calls for them. However, they hop a fence as we hear bullets flung at them and they get in the car. Holy shit, what a scene. One of my favorite things about this scene is about how it knows when to show things in the frame and when to leave them out. When the helicopter goes by overhead, we don't see Rust, and it creates a moment of tension in of itself because we aren't sure whether he successfully evaded. Then another moment is created yet again when he goes to use the phone and we see his captive escape. This is exacerbated even further when the people go to assault him and Ginger is continually out of frame. And then the final miniature conflict is established when they go to hop the fence and are spotted by the members. We don't see them fire at Rust, but we hear their bullets go by and can assume they are doing so. Because they aren't in frame, we can't see where the bullets are coming from, and it only makes the scene more dramatic, as we don't know if their shots are lined up and if they're going to hit either of them. Now if you still haven't seen this show for some reason, I highly recommend you find a way to watch it. And if you are still on the fence, I encourage you to watch this scene on YouTube right now. I've rewatched it more times than I can count, and I've shown the scene to people who have never seen the show before, and they all pretty much agreed they could feel the insane tension without any context. So go ahead and watch it right fucking now.
Help me figure this out. Do not leave me. Stay focused.
Skipping ahead a few years, we have a one-take episode from Season 3 of Mr. Robot. If you haven't seen Mr. Robot, what are you doing? Mr. Robot is currently the best running show on cable. Rami Malek does a fantastic job playing the main character Elliot, and Sam Esmail manages to deliver a show which feels so stylistically unique compared to everything else on television. For those of you who don't know how TV works, since television seasons are much longer than movies, it's very common for different episodes to be handled by different directors. But not Mr. Robot. Sam Esmail has directed every single episode of this program, and it fucking shows. When USA was asked about their thoughts on Esmail directing every episode, they basically said, I mean, we're concerned for his health and all, but we don't really give a fuck. If he wants to do it, okay, whatever. Anyway, let's talk about this episode with as few spoilers as possible. This episode begins very slow and quiet. It starts out with Elliot on an elevator, with both him and the audience unsure how he got there. The camera moves only ever so slightly while he is on the elevator, never drawing attention to itself in this part of the episode. This is a great decision. Beginning the episode at a slower pace and having the audience be just as lost as the protagonist enhances our inherent immersion. We completely empathize with Elliot's confusion. The slower camera lets the audience truly take in every aspect of what is happening in this elevator. Every line of dialogue is slow and feels important.
Hey, it's important.
Is everything okay?
Then he steps off. Once he steps off, the one-take style starts to really pronounce itself. The camera follows Elliot to his desk where he has a pretty comical exchange with one of his coworkers. Again, don't want to be too specific because it would spoil an inherent aspect of how the fourth wall functions in this story, but let's just say it succeeds at being funny. This is also a good idea. Placing comedy like this before a really intense scene helps the audience prepare for what is to come. If the entire episode were made into a massive sprint, perhaps it would lose steam and the audience would find themselves not caring as the episode progressed. But then shit hits the fan when Elliot realizes he's been compromised and the antagonists have begun to set their plan in motion. Their plan involves hacking into the network of the company he is currently working at. Simultaneously, he realizes he has been fired from his job and will soon be escorted out of the building. Meaning, Elliot now has two goals which are at odds with one another. He must break into the network of his workplace in order to help save them from an impending disaster, while also dodging the security detail of that same place. I love the sound design in this episode. Unlike True Detective, which is shooting for true immersion in that scene, the sound design here is incredibly stylized and more about building tension.
I think he definitely loves me.
Sir.
Random bits of static cut in occasionally to symbolize Elliot's broken and deteriorated mind. Ambient music gets louder or softer depending on what is happening in each scene, and the recurrence of the
UN Security Council has gathered today for a much-talked-about vote.
Is so haunting and peculiar. So Elliot runs into a stairwell to evade the security coming to his desk. He realizes his card doesn't work and he gets some random guy to open the door for him at the last possible moment before security catches up. He gets onto this floor and has to convince someone to let him use his desk. He notices an old lady working at her cubicle and concludes he could probably bluff his way onto her terminal. She, however, knows more about technology than anticipated, and starts rattling off why she has maintained total security of all her work data. Again, the comedy here creates a nice pause in the tension. It feels really natural and unforced. Yes, Elliot is being hunted right now, but he has a moment of reprieve. That reprieve is bestowed onto us likewise, with the scene becoming much more funny and lighthearted for a brief interlude. But then the boys come back, and then we enter my favorite part of the episode, a part which I believe highlights why this works so well. So in order to evade them, Elliot attempts to blend into a boardroom. He turns his back from the clear glass sides where the guards are waiting for him. This scene, while still being super intense, is also still pretty funny. Given how Elliot is awkward as shit and not charming and not good at talking to anyone, watching him try to stay in this room creates all sorts of stilted dialogue. Now this exemplifies why the one take was a great idea. While Elliot is making shit up to these guys and putting the entire meeting on hold, we can see guards in the background. Had this not been one take and instead been several, we would likely cut to them in the room and then outside the room and back, but psychologically, your brain would know they aren't actually in the room next to Elliot. Your brain understands that what you would be seeing would be two shots stitched together, probably filmed in separate locations, maybe even on separate days, and that Elliot and the guards are actually not in the same room at all. But by making it one take, we can see the guards behind him. The tension is real because the guards are actually there and the guards are real. Even when the camera pans away from them or when we see them walk out of frame, we know they are still somewhere actually in close proximity to the actors in the room Elliot is in. Rather than having the guards be there because of the way it is edited or how the story is written, the footage literally puts them feet away from one another. This right here is the power of a cleverly written and choreographed scene. In general, I love how this part of the episode has sub-scenes within this one part. True Detective's one take is really just one scene of them breaking and evacuating, but what Elliot's goal is during this episode changes by the minute. At first it's just to use his computer, then it's to evade security, and we get a brief part where he needs to get to another computer. Then to evade security, he has to go into a boardroom and stall as long as possible. His actions shift from work, bluffing, hacking, and stalling, all while also evading. The scene never gets boring because Elliot's actions are incredibly dynamic and changing to solve each sub-problem of his greater goal. So then Elliot leaves eventually, runs for an elevator as a guard goes after him, and barely makes it in time. Realizing he is cornered, he leaves the building and attempts to devise another way in. Then some painful secrets are revealed which fundamentally alter two relationships integral to the show, and the second half of this episode commences. Now while I love the first half, the second half is It starts out incredibly strong by taking us through this crowd of protesters and into the beginning of a riot. Someone throws a single bottle and suddenly the building is being trashed. We pan around the ensuing chaos until we get to Angela, whose storyline is much less compelling. To explain why would be to spoil a huge part of this show, so I will try to refrain from doing so as much as possible, and instead dissect what about the filmmaking drags this part down. For starters, while this part of the episode should theoretically be more intense, it falls flat in many ways. Angela is definitely in more immediate danger, but she somehow manages to evade getting hurt in ways that make you raise an eyebrow. Angela gets caught with security access she shouldn't have, but she's okay because the riot people hit the guard and not her. She walks through these hallways of rioting people, but for some reason she never gets hurt. She goes into the room to do a thing, which is a spoiler, and she hears a crash. Another woman enters who finds out she is up to something illegal. Another dude breaks in to hit her and she runs away. The danger here, while real, feels like a script. It's too dangerous for her to evade so unscathed without suspending your disbelief. This is a perfect example of how being overkill can ruin a scene. I wouldn't call Angela's scene bad per se, but I think if things were just altered slightly, it would be much more compelling. How did the rioting people make it to this floor so quickly? I mean, she's on like floor 42 in the beginning, and the way it's cut implies the riot just began as she is on the phone given her task. So how the fuck did all these people get up here so fast? I ran track for 5 years, and during that time, had to run up 15 flights of stairs at one point. Shit ain't easy, and it takes a lot of time. Now multiply that fatigue and time by about 3, and you begin to question how this entire building goes to shit so fast. Not that many people can fit in an elevator. Furthermore, it would have had to stop at each floor to let them off, and it would take so much time. So how did they invade every floor in like 5 seconds? Or did they only stop at the floors Angela's went to? Either way, it's really convenient. This episode does end pretty fantastically though. I love the final shot so much. The way the music abruptly cuts and ends on these two characters is perfect. Anyway, despite how ambitious this episode is, I can think of at least 2 to 3 other episodes this season that I think are better just off the top of my head. And that's not to say this episode is bad. Actually, far, far from it. This single episode puts the entire TV series like The Walking Dead to fucking shame. Mr. Robot Season 3 is just one of the single greatest seasons of television ever aired. Or at least one of the better ones I've experienced. So if you haven't gotten the memo by now, watch this show. And then finally on the list, we have episode 5 of The Haunting of Hill House. And all I have to say is, why is this one take? No, seriously, why is this episode done the way it is? So this episode has the main cast gathered at the funeral of one of their loved ones. This is the first time in the entire season all the siblings and the father are together in a single room, and I guess somebody behind the camera thought doing a series of one takes would enhance this episode. It really doesn't. So the plot of this episode continually cuts between the present and past, showing this family back in the Hell House during a storm, and them chilling in a funeral home during a similar storm. Everybody comes in basically one at a time and has a weird sort of catching up with each other before shit hits the fan and everybody starts yelling. Painful secrets are revealed. Now, as much as I wanted to sort of praise and dissect what can make a one take so great, I think this episode stands as a shining example of how and when not to use it. Is there high tension in this scene when they're standing in the funeral home bitching at each other? Nope. Is the way the camera moves particularly immersive in this setting? Nope. Actually, the way it moves is borderline fucking awkward. At certain points it zooms uncomfortably close on the characters so you can't see anything else in the scene, and it's so strange and does not complement what is going on very well. Half the time when the camera is this close, all I can think is, oh, they're doing this to move props and the set around off screen, and that's why we're at such a strange position in relation to this character. The best word to describe the one take in this episode is gimmick. Oh, look, they replaced the adult actors with the child ones when the camera spun around. That's impressive. But does it add anything? No, it really just doesn't. In fact, I think the lazier way would have been a better choice. If we had panned to the father walking in, and then did a reverse shot of his perspective to see them all as children, it would implicitly communicate that we are seeing the room from his perspective, and thus having all the adult actors be played by their child counterparts would make sense. But by doing this in a single take, the camera does not imply it as the father's perspective, but rather everyone's perspective. Why does everyone view everyone as a child except their old father? That's kind of strange and doesn't make sense. I mean, obviously you can discern the point was that the father sees them all as children, but the film's cinematography is sending a contradictory message. And the rest of the episode echoes these same problems, except for one single scene close to the end. There comes a point in the episode where the father is running around their house in the past, chasing their mother who is most definitely possessed by a ghost or something. And this scene being in one take makes sense. The narrow hallways communicate a sense of claustrophobia, the way the camera follows the father puts us into his shoes, and there's a real threat of the ghosts and storm which could harm him at any moment. This scene is successfully immersive and has some tension to support it. When the father is walking down the hallway and windows start shattering, you can feel the intensity rising completely genuinely. The biggest problem with the rest of this episode is nothing is happening. True Detective and Mr. Robot each set up miniature conflicts or sub-scenes with their long takes to keep the momentum going. Russ starts out in the house, then he runs outside, dodges a helicopter, uses the phone, runs outside and beats up some guys, catches the dude again, hides behind a house, fires his gun, runs back around the house, hops a fence, and gets in a car. And that's all in 6 minutes. What do these characters do? They stand in a room and talk to each other. Sometimes they yell a little bit.
Oh, fuck you!
But no one is physically doing anything. They might walk in and out of the room, but none of that shit is gonna get your heart going. I'm all for scenes of characters talking in a room. I am a Hunter x Hunter fan after all. But if you're gonna shoot something like this with this style, you want something exciting going on to complement it. The shot they are using is one which is carried by momentum, tension, and a greater sense of immersion. Without it, the scenes drag on and on and on and on. You feel like you're watching a fucking soap opera. Again, not an issue with the content of the scene, but a matter of the presentation dragging it down from something better. Actually, I'm convinced if you recut the rest of the episode to be mostly normal and left this scene as one take, the episode would leave a bigger impact. The scene would be so much more haunting and memorable if it weren't sandwiched between mediocre uses of the same technique. You want scenes in this style to really stand out. Here's the best comparison I can draw in general. Buffalo sauce is pretty good. I like it on my meaty chicken wings, but I would never put it on cereal. Some scenes are cereal, and some scenes are chicken. That's okay. Not every scene needs to be chicken, nor should every scene be chicken. Having normal, mundane, and less intense scenes is a part of telling a good story just as much as creating fast, exciting, and high-intensity scenes. It's all about build-up, really. And as much as I love to see directors spicing it up, and I heavily encourage it, I just ask that we all be mindful of how we appropriate our techniques and style to use them effectively. Alright, that's it. Thank you, goodbye, subscribe, comment, like, share, bon appetit, sayonara, fuck off.
How did I get here?
Today is very different than yesterday.
So this is the world?
I miss my old room.
This wallpaper here just ain't the same.